Canada is a vast and sweeping stage, a land rich in human drama where the actors may come and go, yet their stories endure. They are stories of adventure and hardship, of building communities and a way of life. They are tales of war and reconciliation. Together, they form the thrilling history of this country, and it's a living history. It can be seen at the historic sites that serve as links to the past and as signposts on our magnificent journey. The maple leaf flies over Quebec City today, but the first flag to be planted here was the fleur-de-lis. Samuel de Champlain claimed the site for France in 1608. It became the centerpiece of a dream, the capital of a new France that would sweep west and then south all the way to New Orleans. Champlain built his new city on these commanding heights with good reason. The St. Lawrence River was the strategic highway into the heart of the New World. Quebec City became the gateway. No ship could enter without passing under French cannons. The British also looked at the map and realized that Quebec City was the key to controlling the continent. This is where the fate of North America would be decided. The story of Quebec City is written on its walls. The complex labyrinth of fortifications make it the only walled city in the New World. The fortress city began at what is now the site of the Chateau Frontenac Hotel with the construction of Fort St. Louis. By the end of the 17th century, the British were on the march and threatening. The French responded by building the first defensive wall in just 6 weeks. It was a large log fence called a palisade. The British arrived in 1690 to attack what they called the Gibraltar of North America. When their commander, Sir William Phipps, eventually retreated, it was because of the weather, not the palisade. The close call spurred the French into building more formidable fortifications. The construction of the Great Walls took several decades. Workers were drafted from the surrounding countryside during what were known as corvées. Every able-bodied man from the age of 16 to 60 was ordered to pick up a shovel.
A real fortification wall is mainly made out of earth. It's the earthwork that will do the job, which is mainly to absorb shocks of cannonballs or projectiles. The solid wall is actually mainly there to hold together that very thick earthwork and to close up the fortification wall towards the enemy.
The French engineers applied classic military theories to their designs. Walls were laid out with angles and featured irregular shapes. At the corners, they placed bastions. The bastions offered a clear view of the enemy forces regardless of their line of attack, even if they hugged the walls. Yet these defenses proved to be of little help in 1759. The French army ventured out of the city to confront the British on the Plains of Abraham, just a few miles upriver. They were soundly defeated. Soon, the Union Jack was flying over Quebec, and France's North American empire faded into history. The British then added to the fortifications by building the Citadel. It's one reason they were able to repel an American attack during the Revolutionary War. The British finally left, peacefully, in 1871, a few years after Canada's Confederation. Almost as soon as they were gone, the public began demanding the fortifications be removed to give the city room to grow. The great gates were destroyed. Vandals and neglect began taking their toll. The walls started to crumble and their stones were looted. The historic fortifications might have disappeared entirely had it not been for the intervention of an unexpected savior, Canada's new Governor-General, Lord Dufferin.
Dufferin started to convince everybody of the value of the walls and not of them being obsolete. He said, and we're in 1872, he said that these walls could one day attract visitors to the city. He didn't use the word tourists because it wasn't invented yet, but that's the same meaning. So he started a campaign to convince people. He put drawings into the newspaper proposing to rebuild the gates.
Public opinion reversed, and the city government followed suit. The destroyed gates were rebuilt, but this time they were made wider to allow traffic to flow in and out. Walkways were added to run along the top of the walls. Ironically, the very walls that were built to keep people out are now what draw visitors to come to Quebec City. The Rocky Mountains rise like a towering wall of granite across the west. There's history here, and it can be found at the Mountains Gate in a place called Banff. In the shadow of the Rockies stands a paradox known as the Banff Springs Hotel. When it was built, it was an oasis of civilized luxury in the midst of a rugged wilderness. When the Canadian Pacific Railway drove its last spike in 1885, all it needed was paying passengers and a destination for them. So the railway decided to build a chain of luxury hotels along the line. The site of the chain's crown jewel had already been spotted by 3 railroad employees. Years before, they had stumbled upon hot sulfur springs bubbling up from the rocks in Banff. The immense popularity of the spa culture in Europe, combined with the majestic beauty of the valley, made the site a natural choice. The hotel was designed on a grand scale. Work began in 1886. It was constructed entirely of timber and had 250 rooms. It was the largest spa hotel in the world and quickly became one of the premier destinations. Tourists came by the trainload. Some sought adventure in the mountains. Others opted for the fabled curative powers of the hot springs. The hotel provided luxurious amenities, offered up with an architectural flourish. The spiral stairway was carved from fossilized stone, a touch Darwin would have approved. The Rob Roy restaurant put diners in a scene reminiscent of a Scottish castle. Castilian kings would have felt right at home strolling along the Spanish Walk. Its huge bronze gates could have graced a mansion in Madrid. The Riverview Lounge was a haven where guests could reflect on their good fortune and take time to savor the million-dollar view. The CPR hired some of the most gifted artists from across Canada and around the world to create dynamic posters and advertisements to trumpet Banff's special magic. The Roaring Twenties were Banff's golden era. For kings, queens, and movie stars, it was the place to be and be seen. But the Great Depression brought that chapter to a close. Today, Banff has reclaimed its position as one of the top destinations in the world. Visitors from all over flock here to revel in the spectacular scenery. And lording over this renaissance is the Banff Springs Hotel, a shining symbol of Canada as majestic as the mountains that surround it. Another place that defined Canada to the world lies far to the north, up the spine of the Rockies. Dawson City's moment in the sun was brief, but the legends endure. Tales of glitter and greed that began with a stroke of luck. In 1896, gold was discovered in the Yukon. The news echoed around the world like the sound of a starter's pistol. The frenzy turned Dawson into the largest city in Canada west of Winnipeg. Driven by the lust for gold, men left their families and jobs to travel thousands of miles to the Klondike. Gold fever affected everyone, men, women, and children. Of the 100,000 stampeders who headed for the gold fields, only 30,000 would realize their dreams. Some ran out of money before even getting close. Others found the journey too treacherous and hard. Still others who managed to get to Dawson City found that all the claims had already been staked. Nonetheless, they turned Dawson into a thriving boom town.
Dawson was wild and woolly, I guess. Busy, 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 you know, people all over the place, and people looking for jobs, you know, in 98 and 99 and that, and the bars, saloons wide open, 6 days a week.
In its heyday, Dawson had all the conveniences: running water, steam heating, moving pictures, and even a telephone system. It was an island of civilization that was deadly difficult to reach. One of the most direct routes to Dawson was by way of a grueling trail over the mountains through the infamous Chilkoot Pass. On the other side was Bennett Lake. From here, it was 900 kilometers downriver by boat to Dawson City. So many inexperienced adventurers were making the trek that the government of Canada was forced to impose rules. Every stampeder was required to have 2,000 pounds of supplies before they were allowed to continue. The trail was too steep for horses, so if you couldn't afford to hire Aboriginal packers, you carried the load yourself, 50 pounds at a time. That meant as many as 40 trips uphill. On your own, that could take 3 months. The Chilkoot Trail became known as the meanest and cruelest 32 miles in the world. But they still came. Between the summer of 1897 and the spring of 1899, 30,000 people launched an assault on the Chilkoot Trail. By 1900, the Klondike Gold Rush was all but over. The gold that could be taken out easily by hand was virtually gone. the Chilkoot was a wasteland of abandoned equipment. The rock and soil still held treasure, but getting at it required heavy machinery. Giant dredging machines began appearing on the landscape. They were able to process tons of crushed rock and extract the gold. Dawson was transformed from a boom town into a corporate town. Eventually, even the big mining companies could no longer turn a profit. The last one shut down in 1966. Smaller outfits now continue the hunt. Many of them are family-owned and operated. There's still gold in these hills, enough to lure a new generation of dreamers, and enough to remind us of the time when Dawson City staked its claim as Canada's El Dorado. Klondike gold helped enrich this country as it struggled to find its feet. Some of it undoubtedly found its way into the treasury of the fledgling federal government. Ottawa became the site of a great institution that would turn treasure into an economic engine. The Royal Canadian Mint rose in the heart of the capital in 1905. Its size and scale reflected the building's purpose. It was built like a fortress, to be secure and inspire confidence. The Mint contains one of the oldest and largest gold refineries in the Western Hemisphere. Here, gold is processed and refined to 4 nines, which means it's 99.99% pure. The result is the finest gold produced anywhere in the world. Today, only special commemorative coins contain gold. Silver, copper, and nickel are now the main ingredients. But one tradition lives on. Canadian coins continue to depict the natural treasures of the land. Almost from the beginning, the Royal Canadian Mint has commissioned renowned artists to produce the designs and images that catch the eye of collectors around the world. In 1935, sculptor Emanuel Hahn created this classic silver dollar. It remains a true work of art.
His design of the Voyageur sweeping by an island with a tree and the northern lights just rising from behind the image gives a true feeling of Canada and what the world thought of Canada at that time. But as you look at the Voyageur and the native in the canoe, you see that they're carrying trade bales. And on the first trade bale, you've got the letters HB, Hudson's Bay Company. So that dollar is the only Canadian coin that carries advertising.
The design is then carved and etched into a plaster model. The next step is to use the model to create an epoxy mold. The mold is then mounted on a reduction machine that replicates the design in miniature to create the die. Gold bars are squeezed through rolling mills over and over until they are just the right thickness. Next, a stamping machine punches out blanks. The blanks are then rimmed. That raises the edges to protect the design from wear. Coins must have a very precise size and shape. They must be compatible with vending machines and easily recognized when handled by the visually impaired.
Now we're at the final stage of the operation. This is the press room in which we'll actually transform a blank into an actual coin. Now, in order to do that, what we'll do is we'll use dies and exert 150 tons of pressure to embed the design into the blank. And at the moment that the design is embedded into the blank, it becomes a coin.
Today, most of Canada's coins, about 3 billion of them per year, are produced at the Mint's high production facility in Winnipeg. The old building in Ottawa is now used exclusively to produce precious metal commemorative coins and special sets for collectors. The Mint has given Canada some of its most practical and beautiful symbols. Another building on a faraway island was destined to produce the country itself.
Gentlemen, welcome to our provincial legislature.
When a group of colonial politicians entered this building in Charlottetown, they were British. When they emerged, they were on the road to becoming Canadians. It was September 1864. Province House is where Canada was born. It was originally built as the home of Prince Edward Island's legislature. The fateful meeting sprang from some casual dialogue among the colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. They were contemplating uniting their 3 colonies into a maritime union. The leaders of the province of Canada, which had earlier brought Ontario and Quebec together, had a much larger vision. So they came to the Maritime Conference and made history.
Is one which dwarfs every other question.
Together, they became the Fathers of Confederation. Province House has 2 meeting chambers at opposite ends of the 2nd floor. One is the legislature, where the island's elected representatives still meet. The other is the Confederation Chamber, preserved just as it was back in 1864. Around the long mahogany table, 23 men hammered out the guiding principles for a new Dominion of Canada. It was an amazing achievement, considering the room was filled with political rivals. But personal ambitions and regional jealousies were overcome by a remarkable spirit of compromise. 2 of the fiercest rivals came from Ontario. On one side sat Reform leader George Brown, the publisher of the Toronto Globe newspaper. On the other side was Sir John A. Macdonald, the wily politician from Kingston.
The Confederation movement got started when George Brown said he was prepared to work with John A. Macdonald, a man he hated and loathed and who hated him in return. They just didn't get along, and they never did. And when the 2 of them began to say, this Confederation is a good idea, we'll sink our personal differences and we'll get along, it really began to roll.
The debate continued in every colony for another 3 years. Then, on July 1st, 1867, George Brown wrote the Globe's historic front-page story. The opening line said, "We hail the birthday of a new nationality." Today, Province House is unique among Canadian provincial legislatures. It is the only one to have been designated a National Historic Site. For Canadians, it offers a unique opportunity, a chance to see the very room where their country was born, and a quiet place to honor the wisdom of the men who brought it to life. Canada would eventually span the continent, and with the push to the west came concern. The new government was worried that the vast open spaces might prove to be an irresistible temptation for its growing neighbor to the south. The government decided to lure settlers with generous incentives. It offered up land for lease in Alberta for just a penny an acre. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 amounted to one of the greatest giveaways of all time. For a mere $10, Canada would hand over 160 acres to any young man who pledged to farm it and build a house. One man set his sights and dreams on a piece of land just west of Regina. His name was W.R. Motherwell. He came from Perth, Ontario, and was destined to become a prairie legend. Motherwell headed west with a cartload of belongings and arrived in Saskatchewan to claim his land. Early settlers like Motherwell would endure years of back-breaking work. At first, he lived in a tent and worked the land with oxen. The gamble and the hard work paid off. The land proved to be bountiful. The Motherwell homestead prospered, the family grew, and so did W.R.'s land holdings. It was a story repeated right across the prairies. Homesteader farms were becoming firmly established, and their communities were growing fast. But there were setbacks, and not all were nature's doing. In the spring of 1885, the Northwest Mounted Police were on the march. Louis Riel's rebellion had to be crushed, and the Mounties needed horses, so they borrowed them from farms along the way. Without horses, Motherwell and his neighbors were forced to let their fields lie unplanted for a year. The following year produced a bumper crop, the best they had ever seen. Motherwell realized that leaving a field unseeded for a season gave the soil a chance to revitalize itself. W.R. Motherwell has since been credited with popularizing summer fallowing, a technique still used by farmers across the West. Motherwell introduced other innovations. He was the first farmer in the area to dig a reservoir on his land. It trapped the melting snow in the spring and assured a steady supply of fresh water through the summer. Motherwell also helped change the economics of prairie agriculture. He joined the fight for the farmer-run cooperatives that would eventually operate grain elevators and ship the crop to market. That way, farmers knew they were getting a fair price. Motherwell went into politics and served in both the Saskatchewan legislature and the federal parliament. It was a remarkable career that highlighted the success of all those prairie pioneers. The success of prairie farming would transform the city of Winnipeg. Its location guaranteed it. The Manitoba capital sits virtually dead center in the middle of the country. It was the railway hub for commodities in Canada. Grain from the west, manufactured goods from the east. In the wheat boom just before World War I, Winnipeg shipped and sold more grain than any other place on the continent. It boasted the largest rail yards in the British Empire. The trains also brought in waves of people seeking a new life. Money seemed to flow through the streets of Winnipeg. It became a mecca for the greatest architects and artisans of the era. They dubbed it the Chicago of the North and created the towering monuments of the Exchange District. Winnipeg's building boom was spectacular. At one point, the city actually ran out of cement, sending builders scrambling to find new supplies. "37 massive warehouses were constructed to store the sea of grain and mountains of goods that were arriving daily."
The warehouse buildings are predominantly Richardsonian Romanesque style. And this is a really bold, gutsy style, very chunky architecture. The buildings can even look like cliffs. They just overwhelm the person in scale.
Winnipeg was growing fast and growing rich. The citizens were demanding culture and entertainment, and they got it. 15 impressive and sumptuous theaters appeared, and they rivaled anything found on Broadway. Temples of high finance rose in the Exchange District. 2 national banks put their head offices here. In all, 24 banks set up shop and opened 40 branches. This bold new style of architecture was made possible by a brand new building material, steel. Steel frames replaced iron, which was heavy and brittle. Steel allowed buildings to soar to the sky. The Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce erected a massive granite-walled edifice on Main Street. It's a throwback to the classic Greek style. The solid bronze depicts a banker exchanging funds with 2 patrons and also accepting sheaves of wheat from 2 merchants. A customer walking in through its doors would be awestruck. That was the idea. The polished marble dome ceiling, the sturdy columns down each side, and the rich attention to detail. All of it was designed to suggest wealth, majesty, and permanence. But boom turned to bust with the coming of World War I. Winnipeg lost many of its young entrepreneurs in the killing fields of France. The Great Depression and the devastating effects of drought in the 1930s would bring to an end the era of agriculture-based prosperity. Winnipeg wouldn't begin to grow again until after World War II. The commercial center of the city shifted away from the old Exchange District. That left most of its beautiful structures neglected, but intact. Today, many of them have been renovated and restored, and they now stand as shining monuments to the golden age of prairie life. Just west of Ottawa, there's another monument, a monument to fear and terror. There's not much to see on the outside, but deep underground, there's a chilling reminder of the Cold War. A bunker and command center designed to be the last refuge of a Canadian government determined to survive a nuclear holocaust. That was a very real possibility in the late 1950s. The missiles and the bombers of the United States and the Soviet Union would have crossed paths right over Canada. The public was offered plenty of advice.
11 steps to survival.
Children were shown how to duck and cover in the event of a nuclear blast. Air raid sirens were routinely tested.
And when you go to your shelter, keep listening to the radio. for further instructions.
Pamphlets were handed out with detailed instructions on building fallout shelters in backyards and basements.
All listeners are warned to stay in shelter.
The government followed its own advice and quietly built a network of shelters to protect Canada's leaders. The biggest bunker was located in Carp, about 40 kilometers outside of Ottawa. The press christened it the Diefenbunker, a wry salute to then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker.
How many human beings have been liberated by the USSR?
In case of nuclear war, 540 carefully selected politicians, bureaucrats, civilians, and military leaders would take shelter here. No family members were allowed, nor was Her Majesty's loyal opposition. The bunker was 4 stories high and measured 30,000 square meters. It was carefully designed. Deep wells guaranteed an uncontaminated source of water. It had its own power generating plant. A state-of-the-art communication center would allow the leaders to govern whatever was left up above. There was a large cafeteria and a fully equipped CBC radio station to keep surviving members of the public fully informed. The top 2 floors contained conference rooms and a hospital complete with an operating room. Sleeping quarters were Spartan but comfortable. October 1962. All of the planning seemed about to be put to the test. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba within easy range of the United States. The Diefenbunker was placed on full alert. But the Soviet Union backed down, and the ultimate threat slowly faded away. The peaceful countryside had concealed one of Canada's great Cold War secrets. Now it stands revealed for what it was, a desperate, almost forlorn attempt to offer hope in the face of Armageddon, a prophecy thankfully left unfulfilled. In another great Ontario city, another secret place also lay hidden for many years. It was 1913, and Toronto was thriving. 500,000 people walked its streets. Many of them were lured by the bright lights of the Theatre Marquis. New York impresario Marcus Lowe met the demand by building 2 opulent entertainment palaces, the Lowe's Yonge Street and the Winter Garden Theatre. Both were architectural marvels, richly and opulently appointed. What made these theaters truly unique was that they were built one on top of the other. The Lowe's at ground level and the Winter Garden above it. The Winter Garden was something rare and wonderful. The audience felt as if it was in a magic garden on a summer's night, but it was destined to be left dark and empty for decades. Today, the theaters have been fully restored, and the structure is known as the Elgin and Winter Garden Theatre. The narrow frontage is deceiving. Lowe put the entrance on Yonge Street to give the theaters a prestigious address, but he built the theaters behind it on Victoria Street to keep property taxes low. Back in its heydays, vaudeville was all the rage, and the two theaters attracted some of the famous and not so famous stars to its stages. These ornate showcases attracted audiences like a magnet, especially the city's immigrants. For a few pennies, they could sit in style, and thanks to the slapstick nature of vaudeville, they didn't need a great understanding of English to enjoy the show. The arrival of talking pictures spelled the end of vaudeville. The Low continued on as the Elgin Movie Theater, and the Winter Garden stayed closed and forgotten for almost half a century. The revival began in 1989. It took 4 years to recreate every single detail in the two theaters. Sculptures were re-gilded, chandeliers were rebuilt, and all the original ornate trim was refurbished. Today, the stars are back, and so is the audience. The Elgin and Winter Garden Theater is the only stacked theater in operation in North America. Another relic of Ontario's past is also enjoying a revival east of Toronto. Before the railways and the highways, it was the waterways that linked the country. One of the most vital was the Trent Severn System, a 400-kilometer natural and man-made connection between Lake Ontario and Lake Huron. It strings together a patchwork of lakes and rivers across the heart of the province. It's an engineering feat that was built to meet the demands of a booming lumber industry that needed a great inland waterway to move the timber down to market. But the rivers and lakes all sat at different levels, and that required a network of locks. The first lock on the Trent Severn system was built at Bobcaygeon in 1833. It was a simple lock that used gravity to fill or empty giant chambers to raise and lower boats. By the 1880s, the only remaining obstacle was at Peterborough. The difference in height between the Otonabee River above and Rice Lake below was a challenging 8 stories, too great to be overcome by a conventional lock. The solution was the brainchild of a local engineer named Richard Rogers.
Good afternoon, visitors, and welcome to the Peterborough Lift Lock. We'll be having a transfer momentarily.
Rogers became convinced that a hydraulic lift lock was the answer. The design theory of a hydraulic lift lock is simple. There are 2 chambers filled with water, one at the top, the other at the bottom. Hydraulic cylinders support both chambers. A crossover valve connects the 2 cylinders. The top chamber is filled and its weight raises the lower one. Once again, gravity does the work. The theory may have been simple, but putting it into practice was a challenge. Traditional materials like timber and stone simply weren't up to the job. Rogers decided to use cement, a relatively new innovation back in the 1880s. For 7 years, nearly 100 men worked through every season but winter. It was grueling pick and shovel work just to excavate the foundation. The cylinders for the great pistons and chambers were huge. They dwarfed the men that worked on them. The Peterborough lift lock was finally opened in 1904. It has been operating continuously for almost 100 years and remains as solid and reliable as it was the day it opened. It can lift boats an impressive 20 meters, making it the highest lift lock in the world. Water would also prove to be the economic lifeblood of British Columbia. The Gulf of Georgia was once the foundation of a huge industry that was based on salmon and a simple tin can.
Before anybody arrived here, there was just untold bounty of salmon swimming in the streams and rivers and oceans in British Columbia. And there were people that migrated here and discovered these and lived on them, and their culture flourished. When the Europeans arrived, and they too were overjoyed to find there's such an abundance of fish, but they thought that it might be, the people back home might like the rich taste of salmon, so they started a commercial fishery.
At first, they salted the fish and shipped it out in wooden barrels. Then in 1870, the tin can replaced the barrel. The first cans were made by hand, but by the end of the 19th century, the automated cannery line was introduced. There was a massive increase in output. The fishermen and the cannery owners prospered. The industry helped create towns like Steveston that sprang up all along the coast. The prosperity was based on two things: fish and willing workers. The ocean supplied the fish, and immigration provided the workers. They came from Europe, Scandinavia, Japan, and China. The Chinese were usually the butchers. Their skill with a knife made them the best paid workers in the cannery. Native and Japanese women did what was called sliming, that is, washing the fish. Overseeing the work were the white Europeans. They tended to be foremen, accountants, and engineers. Cannery work was piecework. The faster they worked, the more they were paid. Labor was contracted to a crew boss. He would round up his team and then negotiate a deal with the cannery. And every step of the way, he got a piece of the action.
Rent was one of the things they charged them for, of course. They charged them, you know, $50 for the season for their bunkhouse. They would charge them for water. They took their little commission off everything.
That also included docking workers' paychecks for meals, and even for the firewood that heated their homes. At the dawn of the 20th century, the population of Steveston was about 400 people, but that number soared to over 10,000 during the canning season.
We're fishing for 3 months of the year in the summer, July, August, September, that so to speak, and people had to cram in their entire livelihood into those 3 months. And so it necessitated doing things big and fast and with lots of labor.
The cannery operated much like a factory with an assembly line for a fast and efficient operation. At the dock, the fish were sorted and loaded onto conveyor belts. The cleaning and cutting was done either by machines or by hand. The raw salmon was then packed into cans. The cans were loaded into giant pressure cookers and subjected to very high temperature. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was cooked, and at the same time, the can was sterilized. The salmon was Once the cans had cooled, the all-important labels were applied. Early labels portrayed stereotypical images of native people. During World War I, the labels boasted patriotic themes. By the 30s, labels were designed to appeal to the sportsman and the discerning housewife. And of course, there was the ever-popular Mountie. The seasonal nature of fishing and the unpredictability of the catch forced canneries to find other revenue. The Gulf of Georgia cannery has been used as a place to store nets, a warehouse, and a herring plant. But in the end, it wasn't enough. By the 1970s, the canning industry was in serious decline. Today, the Gulf of Georgia cannery has been preserved as a museum. Visitors can get a taste of what life was like on Cannery Row. It's virtually all that's left of an industry that was once the biggest employer on the West Coast, and all because of a simple tin can. In Ontario, another business based on water shows no signs of decline. Niagara Falls is one of the 7 wonders of the world. But visitors never get to see its full glory. That's because much of the water never makes it over the falls. The water is diverted and then used to generate electrical power. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Niagara has powered the industrial heartland of Canada. It's not the falls itself that generates the power. Further down the river at Queenston, the cliffs are more than twice as high. That's why engineers chose this spot to build a man-made wonder of the world.
What you do quite simply for hydroelectric power is you need to take a pipe of water, put it over a cliff. If you now let it escape, it has push pressure. So if you put a propeller or a blade into that stream of water, it will rotate the propeller. You then let the water flow from above through the tube, called the penstock, into the turbine, drives the shaft, spins the magnets, electricity.
In 1917, 10,000 men began working on what was then the largest construction project ever seen in North America. To carry the water around the falls and down to Queenston, they had to carve a massive 12-kilometer-long channel known as the Cut.
They then dug the canal starting here along and through the city, ran down to the forebay above the powerhouse.
On December 28, 1921, the generators began to spin and the electricity began to flow.
Electricity has come to play such an important part in our daily lives. Now we can't imagine how we ever got along without it. Look how easy it makes mothers work in the kitchen, for example.
The post-war boom fueled Ontario's hunger for more and more power. Ontario's surging appetite for power demanded a second generating station. It would take 8 years to build and opened in 1956. But it was never enough. Today, only 25% of Ontario's electricity is generated by hydropower. and the 2 Niagara stations account for only about 5% of that. The spectacle of Niagara Falls is an impressive sight. But there's another equally impressive sight just downriver. The mightiest power generating station the world had ever seen. There are countless stories in this land. Some have been forgotten. Others live on in legend. At their heart, they are the stories of Canadians, their hopes, their history, and their faith in the future of this great country. And there are many more to come as the magnificent journey continues.